So whether or not you do bead weaving or whether or not you do wire working, one thing that is really important to know is how to get a nice crimp, how to use crimp covers, and what pliers and tools you want to have handy when working with beading cable. Stay tuned for this episode of Better Beader and learn one of the essentials to making jewelry. So in order to become a better beader, I think it's essential that you need to know how to work with beading wire or beading cable and how to finish off the ends correctly and nicely so that you won't lose your lovely piece of jewelry, and also some hints and tricks that I've learned along the way. Sometimes for those of you watching, you may think that you don't really need to know this, or that you haven't had that happen, that you need to look into bead weaving and doing ends of bead weaving. If somebody knows that you make jewelry, chances are that they will ask you to do a simple repair. Many times you'll need to know how to work with the beading wire, also known as beading cable, and how to properly put the ends on that wire. What I want to show you is kind of the steps of starting and working with this beading wire when doing just a basic strung bracelet in this case. You can do the same thing with necklaces, same thing if you're attaching chain, and we're going to go over kind of the ending and starting of that. So to begin, I have some 49 strand bead-along wire, and I've cut 10 inches for a 7-inch bracelet. This allows me 3 extra inches to work with at the end of the project. As you get better and as you work on it more, then you'll be able to kind of cut less or even keep it on the spool of the cable. When I'm working with the cable, I'm going to know that the cable itself is flexible. The higher the strand number, say 49 strand versus 19 versus 7 strand, the 49 strand is going to be the most flexible. The reason that's the most flexible is because it has 49 little pieces of, say, stainless steel wire that are twisted around one another in order to get the thickness that you're working with. I'm working with a 0.018 inch in diameter, which is very common and kind of the go-to size when I'm working with it. 49 strand, again, is going to be more flexible, and it has a nice kind of coating on the outside of it. When we're using our crimping pliers and doing our crimping beads, it's actually going to hold on to that coating around the actual cording. So I have my cable here, and I have that 10 inches cut. I have on the cable a nice bead stopper. So the bead stopper looks like a little spring you pull back on the little ears of the spring. I used to call it Mickey in kids' classes. We pull back and try to get Mickey's ears to touch. And then you're going to put the bead stopper approximately 3 inches from the end of the thread. I have about 1.5 inches here, but that's just so you can see it on the camera. So you have those 3 extra inches so that you'll know exactly kind of what to work with. 1.5 inches back is kind of perfect to put the bead stopper. The bead stopper, again, will come off once you finish the project, but it's helpful to keep the beads on the project. If you know that you are doing a repetitive thing or the exact number, you can go ahead and put one of the clasps on first. I tend to wait till the very end of the bracelet, even if I'm restringing a bracelet, because you never know what may happen. I don't want to have to cut off an end that I've already attached, so I use the bead stoppers to hold the wire, the cable, while I'm working with it. I have my 7 strands of my 7 colors of the chakra stones in the faceted 8mm round. And I have, some of you may have grabbed grab bags recently, and they have these little butterflies here on them, or in them. So I thought I would use those for it. So if you have kind of those dragonflies or butterfly look, I'm going to be using them in my design. So I'm going to put on my chakra stones. And these are in groups of 7. So when you're working with it, you'll have your beads kind of going right along. You can use a bead board if you want, or a ruler to figure out exactly what is middle. I'm literally just keeping the chakra stones in color order. So, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my little dragonfly here right along the middle of the project. So as I put the garnet on and then that amethyst, I'll start to know exactly what I'm working with. When I get to about center, I'm going to go ahead and put on my firefly here. And once I've got on that little dragonfly or firefly and that copper bead, I'm going to let that go back towards the middle of the bracelet. Now, whether or not you repeat and start the bracelet with the same colors on the other side is up to you. I'm going to keep going with that same color pattern of the chakra stone, keep it nice and easy. And you can see I don't really worry too much about what's going on below my fingers. I'm just kind of working with those beads that I have in my hand currently. Once you get your piece to fit and you add, you know, your 6.5 to 7 inches of stone, you're going to get ready to add a toggle clasp or a lobster clasp, push clasp, clasp guarding clasp. The clasp selections are endless. I went over that in the last Better Beader episode, so check that out as well if you haven't seen that. Once you're right to center, I have 2 more beads to add on. You're going to measure your bracelet and make sure that it fits. When measuring, especially if you're using a toggle, the correct way to measure, you can put the toggle on the bracelet. You can see that toggle bar is attached so that way it doesn't lose its mate. And line it up right there and see whether or not it fits before putting on the toggle. You want it to be almost kind of snug, because by the time you get the crimp beads and the crimp covers on, it's actually going to be a little bit larger than that. So once I know that I have my ending here in sight and I have it exactly the way that I want it to, I'm actually going to use a smaller bead before the toggle. This is not always necessary, but when you're working with a toggle, you may want a smaller bead at the very end to make it easier to take that toggle on and off. So I have just a 8/0 seed bead that I'm using at the very end there. And then because I still have the 1.5 inches after the stopper, I don't have to worry about the beads falling off. I'm going to go ahead and crimp and finish off this first end. If you do happen to get a toggle like this, one of the copper toggles, they're usually held together by a jump ring. You can keep that jump ring if you want. I'm going to take it off and remove it from my project since it does have that split or that opening. And it was just there so I make sure that my toggles do not separate and that I have my toggle bar and my toggle loop. It does not really matter what I start with. Even if I was going to use, say, a Clasp Guard and Beautiful push clasp, it doesn't matter if I start with the bar or the loop. I'm going to put on a crimp bead, and this crimp bead is a crimp tube. It's a 2x2 millimeter copper crimp tube. I'm not going to worry about it being really, really close down next to my beads because I still have the other side to work with. Go ahead and add in one side of your clasp, and once that's added in, I'm going to put my wire back through that crimp tube. Push the crimp tube, leaving at least 1.5 inches there, up towards the crimping, up towards the toggle bar. And I want to make sure that my wire underneath the crimp tube is sitting so that they're side by side and not crossing over. Here's where you have to determine whether or not you want to use a needle nose pliers or a crimping pliers. If you're unfamiliar with a crimping pliers, the crimping pliers have a little almost kidney shape section here in the back and then a flat or a rounded shape in the front. You're going to start in the back and work your way towards that front little section of the teeth. What it does is it folds a crease in the middle of the crimp tube, and then you're going to fold it in half so it's folded over. This can become really difficult for people to use, and a lot of times I will just use a needle nose, and I prefer the bent needle nose pliers. I don't want the toggle too close to that crimp bead. I want it to be able to move around so that the toggle is not rubbing up against that crimp tube. I'll use the crimping pliers to show you in this variety here, and then I'll use the needle nose on the other side. When you're using the crimping pliers, you want to make sure that that crimping tube is right in the middle of the pliers and that you don't see it on either end. There are different size crimping tubes, so make sure that you're using one that's appropriate for the crimping pliers. This here 2x2 or 1.5x2, those are perfect sizes. A 3 is going to be too big and a 1 is going to be too small. Once you hit that there in the middle, you can see it kind of folds it over, and copper is a great example because it's nice and soft. And you're left with almost a little kidney shaped piece of wire with your crimp tube. Turning your pliers then over to the front, what you're going to do is turn and fold those two ends right next to one another, folding it down. And that's going to crimp it so that you have that nice little fold over. Again, that can become very hard for people, so I like, and some people will be against it, I like a needle nose pliers and a flat crimp. Generally speaking, if I'm repairing a piece or I'm making a higher end piece, I will also use a crimp cover. So I have two kind of crimp covers here, and with the crimp cover and the turned over crimped bead there, I'm going to put on this side of the crimp cover prior to pushing all of my beads up towards the actual end. Put the crimp cover on. Make sure, so you can see it's kind of that little clamshell, make sure that you're not going to be opening up your crimping bead while you are working and closing up the actual crimp cover. Sometimes people will use the open end, that outer end of the crimping pliers, to close up the crimping cover. I'm going to use just my needle nose pliers and close that right up. That use of a crimping cover gives a nice polished finished look to the end of your piece. You can then push a couple of your beads up and double the wire. If possible, I like to double the wire. It's not a necessity. However, it is nice to have some of that wire doubled for added security as you're working with it. So you can see I'm pushing all of those beads now down next to that clasp. On the other side here, I'm going to take off my wire, my bead stopper, add my 8/0 seed bead, so that way I make sure that it mimics the other side. I'm going to add my crimp tube, and then you're going to add the other side of your toggle loop. When you add the other side of your toggle loop then, you're going to take this extra wire, go back through the crimp bead as well as the 8/0 seed bead and the next couple 8mm faceted beads. I always like to do this right away, keeping that crimp bead down next to the beads. It's going to make it easier as you kind of play a game of pull and tug to get rid of the wire. I'm holding on to the toggle bar really, really loosely. And you can see as I pull that extra wire, the extra wire is disappearing. I'll push that crimp tube down next to my beads, hold by my beads, and pull that extra wire to tighten it up. I don't want it so tight that I'm not going to have any movement on the toggle or that the toggle is going to rub on the crimp tube. Also keep in mind you have a crimp cover that you need to add to the outside of the crimp. If I have the crimp cover that I want to add, I'm going to leave a little bit of extra space to accommodate for that 3 or 4mm bead that I am going to be covering the crimp tube with. Here for a flat crimp, again, I want to make sure those wires are laying right next to one another, and I'm just going to take a needle nose pliers, bent needle nose in this case, and flatten it out. Turning it over completely, I want to make sure that it's as flat can be. And remember, when you're crimping it, it's grabbing onto that coating on the actual wire. Go ahead and stick on your crimp cover, making sure when you do a flat crimp that the crimp cover is going to sit vertically with the opening vertical to the crimp bead. So the crimp bead is going to lay flat right against the inside of the crimp cover, and you're going to close up the crimp cover right along that crimp bead. Then you have, again, that extra tiny bit of wire there, so you have a little bit of play. Nothing drives me kind of quite as crazy as a really, really stiff bracelet. I'm going to go in then with my wire cutters, and I push up on, or pull up on the wire, that cable, push down on the beads, and then I give myself a little cut. That's going to cut off your extra little bit of wire, and you will have, again, like that 3 inches of waste. Don't worry, it's better to have a little bit of waste. It's not terribly expensive for the thread. And then you have your bracelet completed. You can see that because we pulled it tightly, we don't have a lot of extra wire popping out the end. If you do have a little bit of wire there, you can tuck it into another bead. You can also just do a little cut to cut off that extra wire and make that trim down a little bit more. Again, the crimp covers are optional. You can use the fold over crimp and do the crimping pliers if you're comfortable with it, or you can do just a needle nose pliers and a flat crimp. If you notice, and I get this question a lot, that sometimes the crimp beads are actually snapping or breaking, those are usually inexpensive crimp tubes or crimp beads, actually, rounded shape, that you might buy from a craft store. And I always say don't use them if they're starting to chip or they're starting to break. Get nice crimp beads or crimp tubes. They're not that expensive, and then you have a higher quality product that you know is not going to kind of break in half. As with every Better Beader episode, hopefully you learned something. Even if you don't normally work with a beading cable or the beading wire, such as the Beadalon, You still get a knowledge of what to do if you see a lot of jewelry that's strung on this or needs to be repaired, how to work with the crimp beads and the crimp tubes, and also how to put on that crimping cover. Also the suggestion of using some smaller beads at the end so it makes it easier and able to put on that toggle or whatever clasp that you have. If you did get a chance to check out some of our grab bags, it's good use also for that little dragonfly bead and giving you some new information and hopefully making you a better beader. As always, these episodes are designed to give you knowledge that I think is essential for you to learn, to get better at your craft, to make important decisions, and to become a more informed shopper as well. As always, if you like these Better Beader videos, it helps me if you give a little thumbs up. That way I know that you like the subjects that we're going on, what we're talking about, and also what you would like to see more of. Also, if you subscribe to this YouTube channel, there's a little button there in the corner to subscribe. You'll get regular updates when we get new products in, when we do the Better Beader episodes, and also all of the wonderful patterns that are brought to you by me, as well as all of our collaborators too. As always, thank you so much for watching, and if you do need any of the materials to make some of these basic beaded bracelets, we'll stick it in the links below as well. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Better Beader, and hopefully you learned how to become a better ender of your beading cable and basic stringing wire.